Every village has that woman, the one whispered about, overlooked, dismissed as having missed her chance at happiness. At 40, Svala the weaver had become invisible in Hestfjord, watching younger women marry while she grew old alone at her loom. When the village council forced their greatest warrior, Jarl Torald, to take a bride for political peace, they chose her as a cruel joke. The hall laughed when she arrived in plain clothes with greying hair. They expected her to fail, to embarrass the mighty warrior. But Svala had spent decades learning something more powerful than sword skills or beauty. She knew how to build a home. She transformed Torald's empty lands into a place of warmth and laughter. She taught orphans, planted gardens, and hosted feasts that brought enemies together. Soon, the same people who mocked her were begging for invitations to her table. How did a forgotten woman create what every Viking truly wanted: a place to belong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like an old woman's shawl, and in the dim light of her small dwelling, Svala's hands moved with practiced rhythm across the loom. Each thread she pulled carried the weight of 40 winters, 40 summers of watching life pass by her door while she remained inside, weaving cloth for other women's wedding, gowns, christening robes, and burial shrouds. Her fingers, though weathered, were steady and sure. The wool sang under her touch, transforming from rough strands into fabric that would last generations. This was her gift, not beauty, not youth, not the quick wit that made men laugh, but the ability to create something enduring from nothing. Yet in a village where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she bore and the alliances she brought, such talents counted for little. Outside, Hestfjord was stirring to life. She could hear the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against his anvil, the call of fishermen preparing their nets, the laughter of children running between the longhouses, all sounds that reminded her of the life she watched but never truly lived. Svala had not always been alone. Once there had been suitors, young men drawn by her father's modest holdings and her reputation for skilled handiwork. But her father, Olaf the Stubborn, had demanded bride prices that grew higher with each passing year. "My daughter is worth more than some farmer's second son," he would growl, sending away potential husbands one by one. By the time Olaf died, Svala was 35, and the suitors had stopped coming. The younger women had married, borne children, and now watched their own daughters reach marriageable age. Svala remained at her loom, the village's forgotten spinner, useful for mending torn sails and weaving winter cloaks, but invisible when it came to matters of the heart. She had made peace with her solitude, or so she told herself. Her small longhouse, inherited from her father, sat at the edge of the village where the cultivated fields met the wild forest. It was humble but tidy, filled with the tools of her trade, looms of different sizes, baskets overflowing with wool in shades of brown and grey and cream, spindles that caught the firelight like tiny spears. The morning brought an unusual sound, horses approaching at speed. Svala set down her shuttle and moved to the single window, pressing her face against the oiled skin that kept out the wind. A group of riders approached, their cloaks billowing behind them like dark wings against the pale sky. At their head rode Jarl Torald himself. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking him. He sat his horse like he was born to it, broad shoulders straight, one massive hand holding the reins, while the other rested on the pommel of his sword. Stories of his battles had travelled the length of Norway, how he had held the pass at Ironbridge against 50 men, how his war cry could be heard above the clash of shields, how no blade had ever drawn his blood. But it was not his reputation that made Svala's breath catch in her throat. It was the way he carried himself, not with the swagger of a man who needed to prove his strength, but with the quiet confidence of one who knew exactly what he was capable of. There was something almost lonely about him, sitting, so straight and solitary at the head of his men. The riders passed without stopping, heading toward the great hall, where the village council would be gathering for their morning deliberations. Svala watched until they disappeared from view, then returned to her loom with a strange flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She had seen Jarl Torald many times over the years, of course, at harvest festivals, at the midwinter celebrations, at the occasional village meetings where all free citizens were expected to attend. But always from afar, always as one face among many, in a crowd. He was a figure from legend made flesh untouchable, unreachable, existing in a realm so far above her own that she might as well have been watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The stories about him were endless and contradictory. Some said he was a berserker in battle, consumed by a rage that made him more bear than man. Others claimed he was coldly calculating, a strategist who planned every move 3 steps ahead. The women whispered that he had loved once, deeply and tragically, and that his heart had died with his first wife in childbed 15 years ago. What everyone agreed on was that he remained unmarried, which at 35 made him an anomaly among the Jarls. His household was run by his elderly housekeeper, Astrid, and staffed by thralls and servants who kept his lands productive and his hall functioning. But there was no lady of the house, no children running through the corridors, no softness to balance the hard edges of a warrior's life. This had not mattered when Hestfjord stood alone, strong enough to defend itself and wealthy enough to prosper through trade. But times were changing. New alliances were forming along the coast. Young Jarls with growing families were building networks of kinship and obligation that strengthened their positions. The old ways where a man's sword arm was enough to secure his place were giving way to more complex political arrangements. The village elders had been meeting more frequently. Of late, their conversations growing hushed and urgent when others drew near. Svala, invisible as she was, often overheard fragments of their discussions when she delivered finished cloth to their wives. Talk of marriage alliances, of bloodlines that needed joining, of the precarious balance that kept the coastal clans from each other's throats. And at the center of it all, like a stone in a swift stream, stood Jarl Torald, powerful, necessary, and stubbornly unwed. As the day wore on, Svala found her thoughts returning again and again to the image of him on horseback, silhouetted against the morning sky. There had been something in his bearing a weight that had nothing to do with armor or weapons, the weight, perhaps, of a man who had grown tired of carrying the expectations of others. She understood that feeling better than most. The afternoon brought visitors to her. Dor, Ragnhild, the blacksmith's wife, and her sister Thyra, both carrying baskets and wearing the particular expression of women with news to share. "Svala, dear," Ragnhild began, settling her considerable bulk onto the wooden stool near the fire. "You haven't heard, have you?" Svala continued, her weaving, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Heard what?" "About the council meeting," Thyra said, unable to contain her excitement. "They've decided. Jarl Torald is to marry before the harvest moon." The shuttle slipped in Svala's fingers, creating a loose thread in what had been perfect tension. She forced herself to continue working. "I'm sure there are many suitable candidates. The daughter of Jarl Magnus, perhaps, or—" "That's just it," Ragnhild interrupted, leaning forward conspiratorially. "They've narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. All local women. All past their first youth, shall we say." Svala's hands stilled on the loom. "What do you mean?" "The council believes," Thyra said carefully, "that Jarl Torald needs a mature wife. Someone who won't die in childbirth, who can manage a large household, who understands the responsibilities that come with such a position. In other words," Ragnhild added with a meaningful look, "someone like us older women who know the value of quiet competence over youthful beauty." The words hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. Svala felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach as understanding began to dawn. "The three women under consideration," Thyra continued, "are Ingrid the merchant's widow, Solveig the headman's sister, and—" She paused, shooting a glance at her sister. "And me," Svala finished quietly. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of gulls calling over the water. Finally, Ragnhild reached out and patted Svala's shoulder with awkward gentleness. "The decision will be announced tomorrow," she said. "We thought you should know." After her visitors left, Svala sat motionless at her loom as the daylight faded and shadows crept across the floor. Her mind felt strangely empty, as if the news had struck her with such force that all thoughts had been knocked loose and scattered. She was 40 years old. She had accepted her fate as the village spinster, had made her peace with a life lived on the margins. The idea that she might suddenly be thrust into the very center of everything, that she might become the wife of the most powerful man in the region, seemed as impossible as sprouting wings and flying to the moon. Yet the possibility sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. As night fell and the fire burned low, Svala finally rose and walked to the carved wooden chest that held her most precious possessions. From its depths, she pulled out a length of fabric, unlike anything else she had ever made, silk thread that had cost her 6 months. Earnings, dyed with precious indigo and madder root, woven in a pattern so complex it had taken her nearly a year to complete. She had made it for her own wedding dress, back in the days when such a thing still seemed possible. Now, holding it up to the firelight, she wondered if tomorrow's announcement would finally give it purpose, or if it would return to the chest for another 20 years of patient waiting. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the wooden shutters and carrying with it the salt smell of the sea. Somewhere in the darkness, Jarl Torald sat in his great hall, perhaps wondering which of 3 middle-aged women would share his name and his bed. The thought should have filled her with excitement or terror, but instead Svala felt only a deep, quiet curiosity. What would it be like, she wondered, to matter to someone again? The question followed her into sleep, where she dreamed of looms that wove themselves and threads that stretched from her small house to the great hall, binding 2 solitary lives together in patterns too complex for waking minds to understand. The horn's deep voice rolled across Hestfjord like thunder, summoning all free citizens to the great hall. Svala set down her morning porridge, her stomach too knotted to accept food, and pulled her best woolen cloak around her shoulders. The fabric was her own work, tightly woven in subtle patterns that caught the light, dyed with walnut hulls to a rich brown that complemented her greying hair. As she walked through the village, she noticed other women emerging from their homes with careful steps and fixed expressions. Ingrid, the merchant's widow, wore her late husband's finest cloak, the silver brooches at her shoulders catching the pale morning sun. Solveig, sister to the headman, had braided her still thick hair with ribbons and walked with the measured dignity of a woman accustomed to public attention. They did not acknowledge each other as their paths converged toward the hall, but Svala felt the weight of shared understanding. 3 women, past their youth but not yet old, walking toward a fate none of them had chosen but all would accept with whatever grace they could muster. The great hall buzzed with conversation that died as the 3 women entered. Svala had attended gatherings here before, but always as part of the general crowd, easily overlooked. Now she felt every eye upon her, measuring, judging, calculating her worthiness for a role she had never sought. Jarl Torald sat in the high seat, his massive frame making the carved chair seem almost modest. He wore no ceremonial armor, just a simple tunic of deep blue wool and leather breeches, but his presence filled the hall like the heat from a forge. His dark hair, streaked with early silver, was pulled back in a warrior's knot, and his beard was neatly trimmed in the fashion of men who led others into battle. He did not look at the 3 women as they took their places in the front benches. His gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the hall's walls, as if this entire proceeding was happening to someone else. Elder Gunnar rose from his seat beside the Jarl, his gnarled hands gripping a staff carved with runes. At 70, he was the oldest member of the council and the one whose voice carried the most weight in matters of law and tradition. "People of Hestfjord," he began, his voice still strong despite his years, "we gather this day to witness a union that will secure our prosperity and ensure our children's future. The feud bonds between clans have grown complex, and alliances once forged in battle must now be sealed with wedding gold and bloodline promises." A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew the truth behind the flowery words. The southern Jarls were forming marriage networks that excluded Hestfjord. Trade agreements increasingly favored those with family connections. Military support, once offered freely between warriors, now came with conditions and expectations tied to kinship obligations. "Jarl Torald has served this village with honor," Gunnar continued. "His sword has protected us, his wisdom has guided us, his strength has been our strength. But a Jarl without heirs is a tree without roots, strong in the present, but offering no promise of tomorrow's shade." Svala felt her cheeks burn as the truth of her situation became clear. This was not about love or companionship or even political alliance in the traditional sense. This was about producing an heir before time ran out entirely. At 40, she could still bear children probably. Other women had managed it at her age, though the risks were higher and the chances slimmer with each passing year. The council was making a calculated gamble, choosing mature women who might bring wisdom and competence to the match, while still offering hope of securing the bloodline. "The choice before us today," Gunnar said, "has been made with careful consideration of character, capability, and the good of all our people." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the hall like snow. Svala found herself holding her breath, though she told herself it didn't matter which name he spoke. Any of the three women would serve the village's needs adequately. The bride chosen for Jarl Torald is Svala, daughter of Olaf, keeper of the weaving craft, woman of quiet strength and proven skill. The words hit her like a physical blow. Around her, the hall erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. She felt as if she were drowning, sinking beneath waves of shock and disbelief, while the surface world continued its noise above her head. Slowly, mechanically, she rose from her seat. Her legs felt unsteady, but they carried her forward to where Jarl Torald now stood beside his chair. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at her, and she was surprised by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. He was even larger up close, not just tall, but broad through the shoulders and chest, built like a man who had spent his life wielding heavy weapons and carrying fallen comrades. His hands, when he reached for hers, were scarred from countless battles, but surprisingly gentle. "Lady Svala," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow managed to be both formal and warm, "will you accept the honor of becoming my wife?" The traditional words, spoken as if this were a romance from the old songs rather than a political arrangement witnessed by the entire village. She looked up into his face, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not the legendary warrior or the distant Jarl, but a man who seemed as surprised by this turn of events as she was. "I will," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The formal betrothal took only minutes. Elder Gunnar bound their hands with a cord of braided gold, while reciting the ancient words that would tie their fates together. Witnesses stepped forward to mark the agreement with their names on carved wooden tablets. Ale was poured and shared, sealing the contract with the taste of honey and barley. Through it all, Svala felt as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. This woman who stood beside Jarl Torald, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the crowd, surely this was not the same person who had awakened that mourning expecting nothing more exciting than choosing between brown wool and grey for the day's weaving. The ceremony concluded with Elder Gunnar's announcement that the wedding would take place in 3 days' time, giving the village just enough time to prepare a feast worthy of their Jarl's marriage. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the unexpected choice and the preparations ahead, Svala found herself standing alone with her betrothed husband. "Walk with me," Jarl Torald said, offering his arm. They left the hall together, stepping into the crisp morning air that carried the scent of wood smoke and sea salt. He led her along the path that wound between the village houses toward the harbour, where fishing boats bobbed like wooden toys on the gentle swells. "I want you to know," he said, after they had walked in silence for several minutes, "that I had no part in choosing you specifically. The blunt honesty should have stung, but instead it brought relief." "Nor did I seek this match," she replied, "though I understand the necessity." He nodded, seeming pleased by her directness. "Good. We begin then with truth between us. That's more than many marriages can claim." They had reached the end of the harbour path, where a large stone offered a natural seat overlooking the water. Torald gestured for her to sit, then settled beside her with the careful movements of a big man accustomed to being mindful of his space. "What do you Mentas know of my holdings?" he asked. "That they are extensive," Svala said carefully. "The great hall, the home fields, the grazing lands to the east." "Empty," he interrupted. "All of it empty. Oh, the fields are productive and the hall is well maintained, but there's no life in any of it. No warmth. No purpose beyond function." He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon. "I had that once. Life, warmth, purpose. When my first wife was alive, the hall rang with laughter and conversation. She filled every room just by being in it." Svala waited, understanding that he needed to speak these words but unsure how to respond to them. "She died 15 years ago," he continued. "Childbed fever, 3 days after our son was born. The baby followed her a week later." His voice remained steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath it. "I told myself that was enough grief for one man's lifetime, that I would be a warrior, a protector, a leader, but not a husband again. Not a father again. Yet here we are," Svala said softly. "Here we are," he agreed. "And I find myself wondering if perhaps I was wrong. If perhaps there are different kinds of love, different ways of building a life together." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, as if seeing her for the first time rather than the political necessity she represented. "I have heard stories about your work," he said. "How you took in young Astrid when her parents died, taught her the weaving craft, until she could support herself. How you've quietly helped other women whose husbands lost their fishing boats or whose crops failed. You have a reputation for kindness, Svala of the loom, for making something beautiful from whatever materials you're given." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. Those were small things, were they? He stood and offered his hand to help her up. "We shall see, I think, what you can make of the materials I offer you." As they walked back toward the village, Svala caught sight of her reflection in a puddle left by the morning's brief rain. The face that he looked back at her was the same one she had seen every day, for 40 years, lined around the eyes, softened at the jaw, marked by time and weather. But something in her expression had changed. There was a light there, faint but unmistakable. For the first time in decades, she had something to look forward to. The realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. 3 days had never felt so short or so endless. Svala moved through the preparations for her wedding in a strange state of heightened awareness, as if she were experiencing everything through new senses. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer, every texture more pronounced beneath her fingertips. The village women had descended upon her small longhouse like a flock of determined sparrows, bringing armloads of flowers, ribbons, and advice. They scrubbed her floors, polished her few pieces of silver and cruisers, clucked disapprovingly at her humble furnishings before setting about making everything as festive as possible with garlands of autumn leaves and branches of rowan heavy with red berries. "You'll need proper gowns for the hall," declared Astrid, the weaver's apprentice she had trained years ago, now a successful woman with her own shop. A jarl's wife cannot dress like a village craftswoman. But when they brought forth the silk fabric Svala had woven for her dream wedding, the chatter died away. Even Ragnhild, never short of opinions, fell silent as the precious cloth caught the light, and threw it back in subtle waves of blue and gold. "Mother of Thor," whispered Thyra, "how long did this take you?" "A year and 3 months, Svala said, running her hands over the fabric that had waited so long for purpose. "I started it when I was 28. The women exchanged glances, heavy with understanding. They all knew the story without needing to hear it. A young woman preparing hopefully for a marriage that never came, setting aside dreams, but keeping the proof of them safe. In a wooden chest. "We'll make you the finest wedding gown in all Norway," Astrid declared, fiercely. "This silk deserves nothing less." As the women worked, cutting and pinning and stitching with the focused intensity of master crafters, Svala found herself thinking of the conversation she had shared with Torald by the harbour. His honesty had been unexpected. Most men would have offered pretty words about destiny or instant attraction. Instead, he had given her truth, stark and unadorned as winter stone. She appreciated that more than he could know. The evening before the wedding brought another surprise, a knock at her door, long after decent folk had sought their beds. When she opened it, she found Torald himself standing in her doorway, looking oddly uncertain for a man who commanded armies. "May I come in?" he asked. "There are things we should discuss before tomorrow." She stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how her small home must seem to someone accustomed to the great hall's soaring spaces. But if he found her surroundings humble, he gave no sign. Instead, he examined her looms with the careful attention of a man who understood quality craftsmanship when he saw it. "This is beautiful work," he said, touching the half-finished cloth still strung on her largest loom. "The pattern, I've never seen anything like it." "It's something I've been developing for years," she said, pleased despite her nervousness. "The weave creates strength in multiple directions, so the fabric won't tear easily but still drapes well." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "You think like a strategist, create something that serves multiple purposes, protects against various threats." The observation surprised her. She had never thought of her weaving in military terms, but perhaps there were similarities between planning a battle and planning a textile. Both required seeing several moves ahead, anticipating problems before they arose. "I brought you something," he said, producing a small wooden box from beneath his cloak. "It belonged to my mother." Inside, nestled on a bed of soft wool, lay a silver brooch in the shape of a raven with garnets for eyes. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of a master smith's art. But what struck Svala most was the care with which it had been maintained. Someone had polished it recently, keeping it bright and ready for use. "I cannot wear another woman's wedding brooch," she said carefully. "It was not my first wife's," Torald replied. "My mother wore it at her own wedding, and her mother before her. It belongs to the Lady of the Hall, whoever she may be." Svala lifted the brooch from its resting place, feeling the weight of silver and history in her palm. The raven's eyes seemed to catch the firelight and hold it, gleaming with dark intelligence. "There is something else we must discuss," Torald continued. "My household staff. They have served me faithfully for many years, and some may need time to adjust to having a new mistress. You think they will resent me? I think they are accustomed to doing things a certain way, and change can be difficult even when it's necessary." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My housekeeper, Gudrun, has managed the hall since my first wife died. She is capable and loyal, but she may see your arrival as criticism of her work." Svala nodded, understanding the delicate politics involved. A household staff that had operated independently for 15 years would not easily submit to new authority, especially from someone they might view as an outsider imposed by political necessity. "What would you advise?" she asked. "Patience," he said immediately. "Gudrun has earned respect through years of faithful service. Win her to your side, and the others will follow. But if you try to sweep in and change everything immediately, I would create enemies in my own home." Svala finished. "I understand." They talked for another hour about practical matters, the size of the household, the responsibilities that would fall to her as the Jarl's wife, the social expectations she would need to navigate. But underneath the practical conversation, Svala sensed something else developing, a cautious mutual respect, perhaps even the beginning of friendship. When he rose to leave, Torald paused at her door. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. The question was so unexpected, so simply human, that it took her breath away. In 3 words, he had acknowledged that this arrangement required courage from both of them. "Yes," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Terrified," he admitted. "It has been a long time since I allowed myself to hope for anything beyond mere survival." After he left, Svala sat by her fire, holding the silver brooch and contemplating the strangeness of her situation. Tomorrow she would marry a man she barely knew, move into a hall full of strangers, and take on responsibilities she had never imagined. The sensible part of her mind catalogued all the ways this could end in disaster. But another part, a part that had been dormant for so long she had almost forgotten its existence, whispered different possibilities. What if this wasn't just about political necessity and bloodline continuation? What if 2 lonely people might actually find something worthwhile together? The wedding gown lay spread across her bed like captured starlight, ready for tomorrow's ceremony. Looking at it, Svala felt a strange sense of completion, as if all the threads of her life, the waiting, the weaving, the years of quiet preparation, had been leading to this moment. She had spent so long being invisible that the prospect of becoming very visible indeed was daunting. But perhaps, she thought as she banked the fire and prepared for what would likely be her last night alone, it was time to stop hiding in the shadows of other people's lives and step into the light of her own. The silver raven watched her from its place on the table, eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions she had never dared to ask. Tonight, for the first time in years, she allowed herself the luxury of hope. The wedding dawn broke clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows that reminded Svala of the most intricate lacework. She woke before the sun fully cleared the horizon, her stomach tight with nervous energy, and found that her hands were steady as she began the careful ritual of preparing herself for the most important day of her life. The women arrived early, as promised, carrying baskets of supplies and chattering with excitement that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. As they helped her into the silk gown, Svala caught glimpses of herself in the polished bronze mirror that Astrid had brought and was startled by what she saw. The woman in the reflection wore a gown that seemed to capture and hold light, its blue-gold weave creating an illusion of movement even when she stood perfectly still. Her greying hair had been braided with silver ribbons and adorned with late-season flowers that brought out the green in her eyes. The raven brooch rested at her throat, its garnet eyes gleaming against the precious silk. She looked like a woman worthy of standing beside a Jarl. "You're beautiful," Thyra said softly, and there was no flattery in her voice, only wonder. The ceremony took place in the great hall, which had been transformed, with garlands of evergreen and burning torches that filled the space with warm, dancing light. The entire village had gathered, from the smallest children to the most elderly grandmothers, all dressed in their finest clothes for the celebration. When the doors opened for her entrance, Svala felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, but instead of the judgment she had feared, she saw faces filled with genuine warmth and approval. These people had watched her grow from a young woman into middle age, had benefited from her quiet kindnesses over the years, and now they seemed genuinely pleased to see her elevated to a position of honor. Torald waited at the far end of the hall, and the sight of him took her breath away. He wore a tunic of deep red wool trimmed with gold thread, and a cloak fastened with silver brooches that caught the torchlight. His dark hair had been carefully braided in the style of Jarl's, and he wore his finest sword at his side not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the protection he would offer his wife. But it was the expression on his face that made her steps falter for just a moment. He was looking at her with something that might have been awe, as if he, too, was seeing her clearly for the first time. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and ritual gestures. They exchanged rings, carved with runic symbols of protection and prosperity. They shared the traditional wedding ale from a horn rimmed with silver, Elder Gunnar bound. Their hands again, this time with cords of white silk that would be burned later to carry their vows to the gods. When Torald spoke his wedding oath, promising to protect and provide for her, to honor her counsel and value her wisdom, his voice was steady and sure. When it came time for her response, Svala found words rising from some deep place within her that she hadn't known existed. "I promise to be your partner in all things," she heard herself say, "to bring life and warmth to your halls, to stand beside you in prosperity and hardship, to weave our two solitary threads into something stronger than either could be alone." The image pleased her, two separate threads becoming part of a larger pattern, creating strength and beauty together. It felt right in a way that the traditional words about obedience and submission never could have. The feast that followed was magnificent by village standards. Tables groaned under platters of roasted meat, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, and the last of the autumn's apples preserved in honey. Barrels of ale and mead were rolled out, and the hall filled with laughter and conversation as neighbors celebrated their Jarl's marriage. Svala found herself seated at the high table beside her new husband, accepting congratulations and good wishes from a seemingly endless stream of well-wishers. The attention should have been overwhelming, but somehow it felt natural, as if she had been preparing for this role her entire life, without knowing it. "You seem at ease," Torald observed during a brief lull in the social demands. "I confess I was worried you might find all this." He gestured at the crowded, noisy hall. "Difficult to manage." "I've spent 40 years watching," Svala replied. "You learn a great deal about people when they forget you're there." He laughed at that, a rich sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "I suspect I'm going to learn things about leadership I never knew I needed." As the evening progressed and the ale flowed freely, the celebration took on the warm, chaotic energy of all good village gatherings. Children darted between the tables despite their parents' attempts at control. Young men engaged in increasingly boastful tales of hunting and fishing exploits. The older women settled into comfortable gossip while keeping watchful eyes on the talk proceedings. But Svala noticed other things as well, the way some of the women watched her with calculating eyes, clearly wondering how this change in the social order might affect their own positions. The nervous glances from some of Torald's men, unsure what this marriage meant for their own places in his household. The studied politeness of a few of the more prominent villagers who offered congratulations while clearly reserving judgment about her fitness for the role. These were the challenges that would await her tomorrow and in all the days to come. Tonight was celebration, but the real work of building a marriage and managing a household would begin with the sunrise. "Are you ready?" Torald asked quietly as the evening wound toward its close. She knew he wasn't asking about the walk to his hall or the physical aspects of their wedding night. He was asking if she was ready for everything. The scrutiny, the expectations, the delicate work of forging relationships with people who had their own ideas about how things should be done. "I'm ready," she said, and discovered that she meant it. The procession to Torald's hall was lit by torches carried by young men. From both their families, a tradition meant to light the couple's path to their new life together. As they walked through the village streets, Svala felt the symbolic weight of leaving her old life behind. The small longhouse, where she had lived alone for so many years, grew smaller in the distance, while ahead loomed the great hall that would now be her responsibility to manage. When they reached the massive oak doors, Torald paused and turned to face her. In the torchlight, his expression was serious, but not unkind. "Welcome home," he said simply. And as they crossed the threshold together, Svala felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments and compromises would be required, this was indeed her home now. The silver raven at her throat caught the firelight from within the hall, its eyes gleaming like stars, as she stepped forward into her new life. The great hall was even more imposing from within than Svala had imagined. Massive timber beams soared overhead, carved with intricate knotwork that seemed to writhe in the shifting firelight. Tapestries hung from the walls, not the simple woven cloths she was accustomed to, but elaborate scenes depicting battles and hunts worked in threads of gold and crimson. The high table dominated one end of the space, flanked by carved chairs that spoke of authority and ancient lineage. But what struck her most forcefully was the emptiness beneath all the grandeur. Despite its size and richness, the hall felt hollow, like a beautiful shell washed up on a beach with no life remaining inside it. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to disturb its perfect, sterile order. "Gudrun will show you to your chambers," Torald said, gesturing toward a woman who had emerged from the shadows near the kitchens. Svala's first glimpse of the head housekeeper confirmed her husband's warnings about potential difficulties. Gudrun was a woman of perhaps 55 years, tall and angular, with steel-grey hair braided severely back and pale eyes that missed nothing. She wore a gown of fine blue wool that marked her elevated status among the servants, and at her belt hung an impressive collection of keys that proclaimed her authority over every locked door and storage chest in the hall. "Lady Svala," Gudrun said, inclining her head in a gesture that managed to be respectful, while somehow conveying that the respect was given grudgingly. "If you would follow me." The chambers Gudrun led her to were spacious and well-appointed, with a large bed covered in furs and woolen blankets, a carved wooden chest for belongings, and a brazier that filled the room with warmth. A smaller adjoining room contained a washing basin and other necessities. Everything was scrupulously clean and properly arranged. Everything was also completely impersonal, as if the rooms had been prepared for a guest rather than the new lady of the house. "The previous lady's belongings were moved to storage years ago," Gudrun said, noting Svala's observation of the empty shelves and bare walls. Jarl Torald felt it would be inappropriate to leave them in place. "Of course," Svala murmured, though she wondered if the removal had been motivated by grief or courtesy, or perhaps both. "Breakfast is served at dawn," Gudrun continued briskly. "The evening meal is prepared when the men return from their day's work. I have managed the household routines for 15 years without complaint or incident. I trust that will continue to be satisfactory." The words were polite enough, but the message beneath them was unmistakable. "This is my domain, and I do not welcome interference." "I'm sure your management has been exemplary," Svala replied carefully. "I hope you will be patient with me as I learn how things are done here." Something flickered across Gudrun's stern features, surprise, perhaps, at not being challenged immediately. "Very well. Is there anything you require tonight?" "Just rest," Svala said. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to begin understanding my new responsibilities." After Gudrun departed, Svala unpacked her few belongings and arranged them in the spacious chamber that would now be hers. The silk gown went into the chest along with her everyday dresses and her precious weaving tools. The raven brooch she set carefully on the table beside the bed, where its garnet eyes could catch the morning light. Sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. Every sound in the unfamiliar hall seemed amplified: the settling of timber, the distant murmur of servants completing their evening tasks, the soft footfalls of guards making their rounds. And beneath it all, the awareness that she was no longer Svala the weaver, living quietly on the village's edge, but Lady Svala, wife to the Jarl and mistress of all she surveyed. The weight of that transformation pressed down on her like a physical thing. She woke before dawn to find a young maid leaving a basin of warm water and fresh linens outside her door. The girl, barely out of childhood, with nervous eyes and work-reddened hands, bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried away before Svala could speak to her. Breakfast in the great hall was a formal affair that bore no resemblance to the simple porridge she had eaten in her own small kitchen. The high table was set with silver dishes and horn cups, and the meal itself consisted of fresh bread, butter, cheese, smoked fish, and preserved fruits arranged with careful attention to presentation. Torald was already seated when she entered, dressed for a day of estate. Management in practical woolen clothes and leather boots. He rose courteously as she approached and waited until she was seated before returning to his own chair. "I hope you slept well," he said, though his observant eyes suggested he had noticed the shadows beneath hers. "Well enough," she replied. "The chambers are very comfortable." They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional entrance of servants bringing fresh dishes or the arrival of estate workers seeking Torald's guidance on various matters. Svala noticed how naturally he handled these interruptions, listening carefully to each concern, asking pertinent questions, and making decisions with quiet authority. She also noticed how the servants treated her with careful deference, but no warmth, as if she were a potentially dangerous animal that must be approached with caution. They answered her questions politely, but volunteered no information, offered no insights into the workings of the household she was now supposed to oversee. "I thought I might walk through the village today," she said as the meal concluded, "renew acquaintances and perhaps begin to understand what social obligations come with my new position." Torald nodded approvingly. "A wise approach. Gudrun can accompany you and make proper introductions." But when he summoned the housekeeper and explained the plan, Svala caught a flicker of something that might have been panic in the older woman's eyes before her composed mask slipped back into place. "Of course, my lord," Gudrun said smoothly, "though I should mention that today is washing day, and the kitchen preparations for tonight's meal will require considerable oversight." "Those tasks can wait," Torald said firmly. "Lady Svala's introduction to her new responsibilities takes precedence." The village visit proved illuminating in ways Svala had not expected. Walking beside Gudrun, she began to understand the complex web of relationships that connected the hall to the broader community. The housekeeper knew everyone there. Family histories, their financial situations, their personal strengths and weaknesses. More importantly, they clearly trusted and respected her in a way that spoke of years of fair dealing and reliable judgment. When they stopped at the weaver's shop where Astrid worked, the young woman's greeting to Gudrun was warm and genuine. When they visited the blacksmith's forge, the smith's wife invited Gudrun to stay for ale and conversation. At every house, Gudrun was welcomed not as a servant fulfilling duty, but as a valued neighbor and friend. And at every house, Svala was received with polite courtesy that felt somehow hollow compared to the genuine warmth shown to her companion. "You are well regarded in the village," Svala observed as they walked between visits. "I have tried to serve faithfully," Gudrun replied neutrally. "More than faithfully, I think. You have built real relationships with these people." The housekeeper glanced at her with something that might have been curiosity. "A hall that stands apart from its community is vulnerable. The Jarl's strength comes not just from his sword, but from the loyalty of those he protects." It was the longest speech Gudrun had made all day, and the first time her words had carried any warmth. Svala filed the insight away carefully, beginning to understand that her greatest challenge might not be winning over the household staff, but learning from them. By evening, her feet ached from walking, and her head spun, with names and faces and complex family connections she would need to master. But she had also begun to glimpse the intricate tapestry of community that her husband protected and that she would now help to maintain. The question that remained was whether she could find her own place within that tapestry, or whether she would always be the outsider looking in. The third week of Svala's marriage brought the first real crisis of her tenure as Lady of the Hall. She woke to the sound of raised voices echoing from the kitchens, not the normal bustle of meal preparation, but something sharper and more distressed. Wrapping her cloak around her shoulders, she hurried toward the commotion to find Gudrun standing over a young kitchen maid who was sobbing into her hands while broken pottery littered the floor around her feet. The girl's shoulders shook with each sob, and Svala could see blood seeping through her fingers where she had cut herself on the shattered fragments. "Worthless creature," Gudrun was saying, her voice cold with fury. "That was one of the good serving bowls, not some crude pottery from the village market. Do you understand what you have cost us?" The maid Svala recognized her as Inga, the nervous child who had brought water to her chambers, only cried harder. Around them, the other kitchen workers went about their tasks with the studied concentration of people pretending not to witness their colleagues' humiliation. "What happened here?" Svala asked quietly. Gudrun turned to her with barely concealed irritation. "Clumsy hands and wandering attention, my lady. This girl has proven herself unfit for work in a proper household." Svala knelt beside the weeping girl, gently drawing her hands away from her face to examine the cuts. They were not deep, but they were bleeding freely and would need attention. "Inga," she said softly, "tell me what happened." Through her tears, the girl managed to explain that she had been carrying a tray of the good bowls to be washed when something had startled her, a cat, she thought, darting between her feet, causing her to stumble and drop everything. "An accident," Svala said, rising to face Gudrun. "Unfortunate, but hardly cause for such harsh words. The bowl that was broken belonged to the Jarl's mother," Gudrun replied stiffly. "It was part of a set that has been in this family for 3 generations. Svala felt a stab of genuine regret. She understood the weight of family heirlooms, the way certain objects carried memories and meaning far beyond their practical value. But she also understood that accidents happened, and that destroying a young girl's spirit over broken pottery served no one. "Help me get Inga to my chambers," she said firmly. "We need to tend to her cuts properly." "My lady," Gudrun began, "I really think—" "Now," Svala said, using a tone of authority she had not known she possessed. In her chambers, Svala cleaned and bandaged Inga's hands, while the girl sat in miserable silence. The cuts were shallow, as she had hoped, and would heal quickly with proper care. "How long have you worked in the hall?" Svala asked as she worked. 2 years, my lady," Inga whispered, "since my father died and my mother couldn't feed all of us children. And before today, how many things had you broken?" Inga looked up in surprise. "None, my lady. I'm always very careful. I know we can't afford to replace anything, and I know how important it is to keep the good dishes safe." Svala nodded, unsurprised. The girl's hands, despite their youth, showed the calluses and careful control of someone accustomed to handling fragile objects with respect. "Accidents happen to everyone," she said gently, "even to housekeepers who have worked for 15 years without complaint." That afternoon, when Torald returned from inspecting his outlying farms, Svala found him in his study, a smaller room off the great hall where he conducted business and kept his records. Maps covered one wall, and the desk was scattered with pieces of parchment covered in his careful script. "I need to speak with you about household matters," she said. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk. Gudrun mentioned there was some trouble with broken pottery. "More than that," Svala said carefully. "I think there may be some tension in the kitchen that needs addressing." She told him what she had witnessed, including Gudrun's harsh treatment of the young maid. Torald listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful as the story progressed. "Inga is a good worker," he said when she finished. "Quiet, reliable, causes no trouble. I would hate to lose her over something like this." "I don't. I think we need to," Svala said, "but I think we need to establish some things about how the household should be managed." It was a delicate conversation. Torald clearly valued Gudrun's long service and competence, but he was also beginning to understand that his new wife brought her own perspectives on leadership and management. They talked through the situation carefully, considering both the practical needs of running a large household and the human costs of maintaining discipline through fear rather than respect. "What would you suggest?" he asked finally. "Give me a chance." "To work with the staff directly," Svala said. "Let me see if I can find ways to improve things without undermining Gudrun's authority." The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Gudrun fell ill with a fever that confined her to bed, leaving the household operations temporarily in Svala's hands. She approached the responsibility with some trepidation. Managing a great hall was far more complex than running her small longhouse, but also with quiet determination to prove her worth. Her first innovation was simple but effective. Instead of issuing orders from the high table, she began each morning by gathering the staff in the kitchen to discuss the day's needs and challenges. She listened to their concerns about supply shortages, equipment problems, and scheduling conflicts. More importantly, she asked for their suggestions about how to address these issues. "The mussen, bread ovens are not heating evenly," reported Berger, the head cook. "The new wood we received last week is too green, and it smoulders rather than burning clean. Could we mix it with some of the seasoned wood from last year's stores?" suggested one of the kitchen maids. "We used most of that during the wedding preparations," another worker pointed out. "What about asking the carpenter if he has any dry wood scraps from his projects?" Svala offered. "Small pieces that wouldn't be useful for building, but might work well for kindling." The solution worked perfectly, and Svala noticed how the staff began offering their own ideas more freely when they saw that their input was valued. Problems that might have festered under a more rigid management style were addressed quickly through collaborative effort. But her most significant innovation was the introduction of what she privately called story circles. During the evening meal preparation, when hands were busy with routine tasks that required little concentration, she began telling stories, old tales from the sagas, family histories she had learned from her father, amusing incidents from village life. The kitchen, which had been a place of tense efficiency under Gudrun's strict management, slowly became warmer and more welcoming. Workers lingered a few minutes longer than necessary, contributing their own stories and observations. Laughter became common, and with it a sense of shared purpose that made even the most tedious tasks more bearable. When Gudrun recovered from her illness and returned to duty, she found a household that was running smoothly, but felt somehow different. The work was getting done indeed. It seemed to be getting done more efficiently than before, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that were harder to quantify. "The staff seems quite content," she observed to Svala with careful neutrality. "They work hard," Svala replied. "I think they deserve to find some pleasure in their labor." It was not quite a challenge to Gudrun's authority, but it was clearly a different philosophy of management. The question that remained was whether the two approaches could coexist peacefully, or whether the household would become a battleground between competing visions of how things should be done. Svala hoped for cooperation, but prepared herself for conflict. The revelation came on a grey morning in late autumn, when the first snow dusted the ground and the harbour lay mirror-still under a pewter sky. Svala had been married for 2 months and was beginning to feel settled in her role as Lady of the Hall when a messenger arrived from the Southern Territories with news that would reshape everything she thought she understood about her marriage. She was in the weaving room she had established in one of the hall's smaller chambers, working on a tapestry that would commemorate Torald's victory at Ironbridge, when she heard the commotion of horses in the courtyard. The sound of urgent hoofbeats always brought tension to any hall. Messengers who rode hard usually carried news that required immediate attention, and such news was rarely good. Through the window, she watched Torald stride across the courtyard to meet a travel-stained rider who bore the colours of Jarl Magnus of Southfjord. The conversation was brief and intense, with much gesturing and nodding of heads. Then both men hurried toward the hall, their expressions grim. Svala set aside her weaving and made her way to the great hall, where she found Torald in urgent consultation with the messenger and several of his senior men. The visitor was a young warrior named Eric, whom she recognized as one of Jarl Magnus's most trusted retainers. "Lady Svala," Torald said as she approached, "you should hear this news as well. It affects our entire region." Eric bowed respectfully before delivering his message. "My Jarl sends word that the northern clans have formed an alliance under Bjorn Ironhand. They plan to move south before the winter makes travel impossible, claiming rights to territory that has belonged to the coastal Jarls for 3 generations. The word sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Bjorn Ironhand was a name spoken in whispers, a war chief from the far north who had spent the last 5 years conquering and absorbing smaller clans into his growing confederation. His warriors were said to be as fierce as winter wolves and twice as ruthless. "How many men?" asked Olav, Torald's war chief. "Our spies report at least 800, perhaps more," Eric replied. "They've been gathering since midsummer, and their advanced scouts have already been seen along the Eric Thorndale border." Torald studied the map spread across the high table, his finger tracing potential routes of invasion. "If they take Thorndale, they control the eastern approach to our lands, and if they move quickly enough, they could be at our borders before the worst snows block the Tooth." "Mountain passes," Olav finished grimly. "There's more," Eric continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Jarl Magnus has received word from other coastal Jarls. They're forming a defensive alliance, pooling resources and warriors to meet this threat. But—" he paused, glancing meaningfully at Svala. "Speak freely," Torald commanded. "The alliance requires certain guarantees of commitment, proof that each Jarl has strong reasons to fight rather than negotiate separate terms with Bjorn Ironhand. They want assurance that no member of the alliance will be tempted to switch sides if the war goes badly." Svala felt the weight of understanding settle on her like a stone. "They want proof of bloodline connections, children who would lose their inheritances if their fathers were defeated." Eric nodded reluctantly. "Family ties that make betrayal impossible. The other, Jarls. They all have sons and daughters whose futures depend on victory. They question whether a man without heirs has sufficient motivation to fight to the death rather than seek accommodation with the enemy." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the hall understood the implications immediately. Torald's marriage to Svala had been politically motivated, designed to create exactly the kind of family connections that would make him a reliable ally. But 2 months was hardly enough time to produce the heir that would satisfy the alliance's requirements. "How long do the sirs we have?" Torald asked quietly. "The alliance will formalize terms in 3 weeks' time. Each Jarl must present evidence of his commitment to the common cause." Eric's meaning was clear. They needed to demonstrate that Svala was with child or face exclusion from the defensive coalition. After Eric was given food and lodging for the night, Torald and Svala found themselves alone in his study, the weight of impossible expectations settling between them like fog. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I never intended for you to be subjected to this kind of scrutiny." Svala stared at the maps, scattered across his desk, seeing in their careful lines the political realities that had shaped her entire life. "You married me because the council believed I might still bear children. This was always part of the arrangement." "Was it?" Torald moved to stand beside the window, gazing out at the day, darkening sky. Or was I telling myself comfortable lies about duty and necessity while ignoring what I really wanted? The confession surprised her. In 2 months of marriage, he had been unfailingly courteous and considerate, but always with the careful reserve of a man honoring a political contract. This was the first time she had heard him speak of personal desires. "What did you want?" she asked softly. "Peace," he said simply. "An end to the emptiness, someone to share the burden of leadership and the small pleasures of daily life." I told myself that was enough, that asking for more would be unfair to both of us. Svala felt her heart constrict with something that might have been grief or might have been hope. And now he turned to face her, and she was startled by the vulnerability in his expression. "Now I find myself caring more about your happiness than about political alliances, which is either wisdom or folly, depending on one's perspective." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. For 2 months they had been careful with each other, polite and considerate and determinedly practical. But underneath the surface politeness, something deeper had been growing, a genuine affection based on shared values and quiet understanding. "There may be another way," Svala said slowly, an idea taking shape in her mind. "A way to satisfy the alliance's requirements without deception." Torald raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." The other. "Jarls want evidence of your commitment to the region's defense. They assume that can only come through biological children who would inherit your lands. But what if there were other kinds of family ties? Other forms of commitment that would be just as binding?" She explained her idea carefully, watching his expression shift from puzzlement to understanding to something approaching admiration. "It's audacious," he said finally, "and it would require the cooperation of people who have no obligation to help us. But it might work," Svala insisted, "if we can convince them that our commitment to this community runs deeper than blood ties, that we have created bonds of loyalty and affection that make betrayal impossible. The alliance leaders may not see it that way. Then we make them see it. We show them something so compelling they cannot dismiss it." That night, as Svala lay awake planning the most ambitious project of her life, she reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this point. 2 months ago, she had been a forgotten weaver living on the margins of village life. Now she was plotting to reshape the political landscape of the entire coastal region. The irony was not lost on her that in seeking to prove their commitment to community, she and Torald might finally discover what their marriage could become when it was based on choice rather than necessity. But first, they had to survive the next 3 weeks. The silver raven brooch gleamed in the firelight from its place on her bedside table, its garnet eyes reflecting the flames like tiny beacons of hope in the darkness. Tomorrow would begin the most important weaving of her life, not of thread and wool, but of human relationships and shared purpose. She had always been good at seeing patterns in complex designs, at understanding how individual threads contributed to the strength of the whole. Now she would discover whether those same skills could work with people instead of textiles. The future of Hestfjord and perhaps of her marriage might depend on her success. The next morning brought a flurry of activity, unlike anything the hall had seen since the wedding feast. Svala moved through the corridors with purpose, gathering the key people who would make her audacious plan possible. But first, she needed to test her theory with someone whose judgment she trusted completely. She found Gudrun in the storage chambers, conducting her weekly inventory of supplies, a task the housekeeper approached with the methodical precision of a military commander planning a campaign. The older woman looked up from her ledger with surprise when Svala appeared in the doorway. "My lady, is there something you require?" "Your counsel," Svala said simply, "and perhaps your help with something that may seem impossible." She outlined her plan carefully, watching Gudrun's face for signs of skepticism or dismissal. Instead, she saw the housekeeper's sharp mind, working through the implications and possibilities with the same analytical approach she brought to managing household supplies. "It's ambitious," Gudrun said finally, "and it would require perfect coordination. One mistake, one person who fails to understand their role, would ruin everything." Svala agreed. "That's why I need your help. You know these people better than anyone. You understand what motivates them, what they're capable of, what would make them willing to take risks for something larger than themselves." For a long moment, Gudrun studied her with those pale, calculating eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, the first genuine smile Svala had ever seen from her. "You're not what I expected," the housekeeper said. "When the Jarl announced his marriage, I thought—" She paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "I thought we would be getting another ornamental wife. Someone who would sit prettily at the high table and leave the real work to others. And instead, we got a strategist," Gudrun said with something approaching respect. "Very well. Tell me exactly what you need." The first phase of the plan required careful timing and absolute discretion. Over the next 3 days, Svala made a series of seemingly routine visits throughout the village and surrounding farms. To casual observers, she was simply fulfilling the social obligations of her new position, calling on families, inquiring about their welfare, offering assistance where needed. But each visit had a deeper purpose. At the weaver's workshop, she spoke quietly with Astrid about a special commissioned tapestries that would tell the story of Hestfjord's history, its triumphs and traditions, but with patterns so complex they would require the cooperation of multiple skilled craftsmen working in perfect harmony. At the blacksmith's forge, she discussed the creation of commemorative items, not weapons, but tools and household objects that would represent the bonds between the hall and the community it protected. At the carpenter's workshop, she outlined plans for wooden sculptures that would capture the essence of local traditions and values. Each conversation was carefully crafted to seem casual while conveying specific information about timing, coordination, and the larger purpose that connected all these individual efforts. By the end of the 3rd day, nearly every skilled craftsman in Hestfjord was working on components of a project they understood only partially, but which they approached with growing enthusiasm. The children were crucial to the second phase. Svala began spending her afternoons in the village square, teaching them songs and stories that seemed like simple entertainment, but which carried deeper messages about community, loyalty, and the bonds that tied people together across generations. Young voices, she knew, had a power to move hearts that adult speeches could never match. "Why are we learning all these old songs, Lady Svala?" asked Berta, a bright girl of perhaps 10 years. "Because songs carry memories," Svala replied, helping the child with a particularly complex melody. "And memories keep communities strong, even when everything else changes." The girl nodded. Solemnly, though Svala suspected she didn't fully understand the significance of what they were preparing. That was probably for the best. Children performed most naturally when they weren't burdened with adult anxieties about success and failure. Meanwhile, Torald was managing the military preparations with his characteristic thoroughness. Messages went out to trusted allies, requesting their presence for what was described as a gathering of regional importance. Weapons were sharpened and armor was polished, not for war, but for the formal presentation that would determine whether Hestfjord stood alone against Bjorn Ironhand or as part of a larger defensive coalition. The most delicate negotiations involved the village elders and prominent families. These were people who had lived through wars and political upheavals, who understood the stakes involved in the upcoming alliance meeting. They also understood that Svala's plan represented a significant risk. If it failed, Hestfjord might find itself isolated at the worst possible time. "You're asking us to stake everything on a performance," said Elder Gunnar during one of their private consultations. "What if the alliance leaders are not moved by displays of community solidarity? What if they insist on traditional bloodline guarantees? Then we face that challenge when it comes, Svala replied. But if we present something compelling enough, something that demonstrates our strength and unity in ways that mere biological ties cannot match, we might change how they think about alliance requirements entirely. And if we don't? Svala met his gaze steadily. Then we'll have shown our people that we're willing to fight for them in every way possible. Sometimes that kind of leadership matters more than victory itself. As the days passed, the transformation of the hall and village became impossible to ignore. What had started as individual projects began to weave together into something larger and more complex. The tapestries Astrid and her workers were creating told interconnected stories that celebrated not just Hestfjord's past, but its vision for the future. The metalwork from the blacksmith's forge incorporated motifs that echoed the textile patterns, creating visual harmonies that spoke of shared purpose and coordinated effort. Most remarkably, the work was bringing together people who had previously operated in separate spheres of village life. Young apprentices worked alongside master craftsmen, sharing techniques and insights. Women who rarely spoke to each other found themselves collaborating on complex projects that required multiple skills. Children who normally played in separate groups came together to learn the songs and stories that would be part of the final presentation. Gudrun, observing these developments with her characteristic sharp-eyed attention, made an observation that surprised Svala with its insight. "You're not just preparing for the alliance meeting," she said one evening as they reviewed the progress on various projects. "You're changing how this community thinks about itself." "How do you mean?" "For 15 years, since the Jarl's first wife died, this has been a place that functioned but didn't thrive. People did. Their work fulfilled their obligations, but there was no sense of shared purpose beyond mere survival. Now," Gudrun gestured toward the hall, where the sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the kitchens, where several women were working on banner designs. "Now, they're creating something together. They're invested in a vision of what Hestfjord could become, not just what it has been." Svala felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the success of her strategic planning. "Is that such a bad thing?" "On the contrary," Gudrun said with another of her rare smiles. "It's exactly what this place has needed, what I've been hoping someone would bring to it." The admission was startling in its honesty. "You were hoping?" "I've watched the Jarl for 15 years, Gudrun said quietly. "Watched him fulfill his duties, protect his people, manage his responsibilities with honor and competence. But I've also watched him grow more distant, more isolated, as if he were afraid to invest too much of himself in anything that might be taken away. And I've watched this community do the same function efficiently, but live cautiously, afraid to hope for anything beyond basic security." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "You've given them permission to dream again, to believe that they might create something worth fighting for, not just something worth defending." On the final night before the Alliance delegation's arrival, Svala stood in the great hall, surveying the preparations. The space had been transformed from the austere, imposing chamber she had first entered as a new bride into something that felt alive with purpose and possibility. Tapestries covered the walls, their intricate patterns catching the light from dozens of oil lamps and creating the illusion of movement and depth. Tables displayed examples of local craftsmanship that spoke of both ancient traditions and innovative approaches to old problems. But more importantly, the hall was filled with people, not just the household staff and village leaders, but families with children, craftsmen with apprentices, elderly residents with decades of community memory. They moved through the space with obvious pride, discussing the various displays, pointing out particular details to visitors, clearly invested in the success of what they had created together. Torald appeared at her side, magnificent in his finest ceremonial armor, but somehow less intimidating than usual, perhaps because he too seemed caught up in the anticipation and hope that filled the hall. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. Win or lose, this community will never be the same." "We've accomplished something remarkable," Svala corrected. "None of this would have been possible without your support and the cooperation of people who had no obligation to trust us." "Trust," he repeated, thoughtfully. "Yes, I think that's exactly what you've built here. Not just between us and them, but among all of us." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the salt smell of an approaching storm. Tomorrow would bring the Alliance delegation and the test of everything they had worked to create. Success would mean protection for their community and validation of their approach to leadership. Failure would mean isolation at the worst possible time and the personal disappointment of dreams that had grown larger than either of them had expected. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth and energy of people working together toward a common goal, Svala felt something she had never experienced before: the deep satisfaction of belonging, not just to a place, but to a purpose larger than herself. The Alliance delegation arrived with the dawn, their horses' hooves ringing against the frost-hardened ground like hammers on anvils. From her chamber window, Svala watched the procession wind through the village, 12 men representing the 5 most powerful jarls of the coastal region, their banners snapping in the sharp morning wind. At their head rode Jarl Magnus himself, his grey beard braided with silver rings that caught the pale sunlight. These were men who had spent their lives making decisions that affected thousands of people. They carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to being obeyed without question, and their eyes missed nothing as they surveyed Hestfjord's defenses and evaluated its strategic value. Svala's hands trembled slightly as she fastened the raven brooch at her throat. Everything they had worked for in the past 3 weeks would be tested in the next few hours. The community had responded magnificently to her call for unity and creativity, but would their collective effort be enough to convince these pragmatic war leaders to take a chance on something unprecedented? In the great hall, Torald stood ready to receive his guests. He wore his finest armor-polished mail that gleamed like silver scales, a sword that had belonged to his grandfather, and a cloak fastened with brooches that marked his lineage and achievements. But it was his bearing that truly commanded attention. He looked like what he was, a man prepared to fight for everything he valued. The formal greetings followed ancient protocols. Each delegation member was announced by name and achievement, their war records recited with the precision of bards who had memorized such details across generations. Ale was served in the finest cups, and the traditional words of welcome were spoken with ceremonial gravity. But underneath the courtesy, Svala could feel the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. These men had not traveled through dangerous territory merely to exchange pleasantries. They had come to judge whether Torald of Hestfjord was worth the risk of including in their defensive alliance. "You honor us with your presence," Torald said when the formalities concluded. "I trust your journey was without incident?" "The roads remain clear for now," replied Jarl Magnus, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken concerns. "But our scouts report increased activity from the northern clans. Bjorn Ironhand's forces are moving south faster than anticipated, which makes this meeting all the more crucial," added Jarl Sven of Westmark, a lean man with calculating eyes. "We need allies we can trust completely. Men whose commitment to our common cause cannot be," we questioned. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone present understood what was being discussed, not military strategy or resource allocation, but the fundamental question of loyalty and reliability in wartime. "Indeed," Torald replied evenly, "trust must be earned and demonstrated, not simply claimed." "Precisely," said Magnus, leaning forward slightly. Which brings us to the matter of your recent marriage. His gaze shifted to Svala, appraising her with the frank evaluation of a man assessing a potential investment. We had hoped to hear announcement of an heir by now, some guarantee that your bloodline has a future worth fighting for. Svala felt every eye in the hall focus on her with uncomfortable intensity. This was the moment she had prepared for, yet actually facing it made her mouth go dry and her heart race. The speech she had rehearsed dozens of times seemed to evaporate from her mind. "My lords," she began, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "you speak of bloodlines and inheritance as if they were the only bonds that tie people to their homeland. But I would suggest that there are connections far stronger than blood, connections forged through choice and maintained through shared struggle." "Pretty words," said Jarl Eric of Ironshaw, his tone skeptical. "But when battle comes and men face death, it is the thought of their son's inheritance that gives them courage to fight rather than flee." "Is it?" Svala asked, taking a step forward. "Or is it something deeper, the knowledge that their sacrifice protects a way of life they have helped to create, a community they have invested themselves in so thoroughly that its destruction would be the destruction of everything that makes life meaningful?" She gestured toward the decorated hall around them, where the fruits of 3 weeks' collaborative labor created a visual testament to community, creativity, and shared purpose. "You see, these tapestries, these carvings, these examples of craftsmanship, each was created not by a single person, working alone, but by multiple hands, guided by a common vision. The patterns you see tell stories that belong to all of us, past glories shared by the entire community, future hopes that inspire continued effort." Magnus studied the nearest tapestry with professional interest. "Impressive work. But how does artistic collaboration translate to military reliability?" "Because," Svala said, "the same bonds that enable creative cooperation enable military loyalty. When people have built something together, they will fight together to preserve it." The delegation exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their skepticism. They had come expecting traditional guarantees of alliance, reliability, marriage bonds that created inherited obligations, children whose futures depended on their father's political choices. Instead, they were being offered something far less tangible and far more difficult to evaluate. "You ask us to base our military planning on philosophy rather than practical considerations," Sven observed. "I ask you to consider that the strongest foundations for loyalty may not be the most obvious ones," Svala replied. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the demonstration that would either vindicate her theory or expose it as wishful thinking. Svala stepped aside and nodded toward Gudrun, who had been waiting near the hall's entrance. At the signal, the great doors swung open, and the demonstration Svala had orchestrated began to unfold with the precision of a military formation. The first to enter were the children, their clear voices rising in harmony as they sang the songs Svala had taught them. But these were not simple folk melodies. They were musical narratives that told the story of Hestfjord's founding, its struggles against raiders and harsh winters, its triumphs in trade and craftsmanship. As they sang, the children moved through the hall, arranging themselves in patterns that echoed the designs of the tapestries on the walls, creating a living illustration of community bonds. Following the children came the craftsmen, carrying the works they had created over the past 3 weeks. But instead of simply displaying finished pieces, they demonstrated how their individual skills connected and supported each other. The blacksmith showed how his tools enabled the carpenter's precision. The carpenter revealed how his work provided frames for the weaver's art. The weavers displayed how their innovations in technique had inspired new approaches in other crafts. Each demonstration was brief but compelling, showing not just technical skill, but the deep interconnection of abilities that made the community stronger than the sum of its parts. Jarl Magnus leaned forward, his attention clearly caught despite his initial skepticism. "Impressive coordination, but this is performance, not proof of military loyalty. "Is it?" asked a new voice from the hall's entrance. All heads turned to see Olav, Torald's war chief, entering with a group of armed men. But these were not Torald's household guards. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen, each carrying weapons but also tools of their trades. "3 days ago," Olav announced, "riders were spotted on our eastern borders. Scouts, we believed, testing our defenses. I called for volunteers to patrol the borderlands, dangerous work that would take them away from their families and their livelihoods during the crucial harvest season." He gestured to the men who had entered with him. "These are the volunteers, not professional, warriors bound by oath or payment, but free citizens who chose to risk themselves for the protection of their community." One of the volunteers stepped forward, Berger, the head cook from the hall's kitchen. In addition to his cooking knives, he carried a short sword and a shield marked with Hestfjord's emblem. "I have never been a warrior," he said simply, addressing the delegation directly. "My battles are fought with ovens and spice jars. But when the call came to defend what we have built here, there was no question of whether I would answer. This place, these people, they are worth fighting for because they are part of who I am." Similar testimonies followed from the other volunteers, each man explaining in his own words why he had chosen to take up arms for a community that offered no formal rewards for such service. They spoke of neighbors who had helped them through difficult times, of skills shared freely, of projects undertaken collectively that had improved life for everyone. The delegation listened with growing attention as the pattern Svala had woven became clear. This was not just a performance or a philosophical argument. It was evidence of bonds so strong that people would literally risk their lives to preserve them. "You see," Svala said as the testimonies concluded, "the loyalty you seek is already here. It has been demonstrated not in words, but in choices. The choice to contribute time and skill to collective projects, the choice to volunteer for dangerous service, the choice to invest themselves so completely in this community's welfare that its destruction would be unthinkable." Jarl Sven studied the faces of the volunteers with professional interest. "These men would fight?" "These men will fight," Torald corrected, firmly, "not because they must, but because they choose to. And that, I submit, makes them more reliable allies than warriors bound only by duty or payment." The delegation conferred among themselves in low voices while the hall waited in tense silence. Svala watched their faces, trying to read the outcome in their expressions. Magnus looked thoughtful, but uncommitted. Sven seemed impressed despite himself. Eric remained skeptical, his arms crossed and his jaw set in stubborn resistance to persuasion. Finally, Magnus spoke. "What you have shown us is remarkable. The level of community, integration, the willingness of civilians to take up arms, these are valuable assets. But the question remains, how do we know this loyalty will extend to broader alliance obligations? Fighting for one's own village is one thing. Marching to defend distant allies is quite another." It was a fair challenge, and Svala felt the weight of it. Everything they had demonstrated proved local loyalty, but alliance membership required commitment to causes that might not directly benefit Hestfjord. "Allow me to answer that," said a voice from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see Elder Gunnar, making his way slowly through the crowd, leaning heavily on his carved staff, but moving with unmistakable dignity and purpose. "I am old enough to remember the last great alliance," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall. "I fought beside men from villages I had never seen, for causes I understood only dimly. And I learned something that young warriors often miss, that the strongest bonds are not forged in blood or obligation, but in shared values and mutual respect." He stopped before the delegation, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "What you have witnessed here today is not just loyalty to place, but commitment to principle. These people have chosen to build something worth defending. Give them allies who share that commitment, and they will defend those allies as fiercely as they defend their own homes. The old man's words seemed to settle over the hall like benediction, carrying the weight of lived experience and hard-won wisdom. Magnus nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing in his weathered features. Very well. Hestfjord has demonstrated bonds of loyalty that satisfy our requirements. You will be welcomed into the Tectant alliance. Relief flooded through Svala. So suddenly she felt her knees weaken. They had done it not just secured military protection for their community, but validated an entirely new approach to alliance building based on chosen loyalty rather than inherited obligation. 6 months after the alliance delegation's visit, Svala stood in the same spot where she had first entered Torald's hall as his bride, but the woman who stood there now bore little resemblance to the nervous, uncertain person who had crossed that threshold on her wedding night. The hall itself had been transformed as, well, where once there had been austere grandeur, now there was warmth and life. The tapestries that had been created for the alliance demonstration had become permanent fixtures, their intricate patterns catching the firelight and creating an atmosphere of welcome rather than intimidation. Children played near the great hearth while their mothers worked on various projects, their laughter mixing with the sounds of conversation and productive activity. But the most significant change was less visible. It lived in the relationships between people, in the way the community had learned to see itself not just as individuals sharing the same location, but as participants in a collective enterprise that made all of them stronger. The northern clans have withdrawn beyond the Thorndale passes, Torald reported, entering the hall with mud on his boots and satisfaction in his voice. Magnus's scouts confirm that Bjorn Ironhand has decided to seek easier targets elsewhere. Svala looked up from the loom she had installed near the great windows, where the light was best for detailed work. So the alliance served its purpose. More than that, Torald said, settling into the dime chair beside her workspace. It changed how the coastal Jarls think about cooperation. 3 other communities have requested guidance on building the kind of civilian loyalty we demonstrated. Your approach is becoming a model for others. The irony was not lost on either of them. What had begun as a desperate improvisation to satisfy alliance requirements had evolved into a new understanding of leadership and community building. Svala's belief that chosen bonds could be stronger than inherited ones was being tested and validated across the region. I had a letter from my cousin in Eastmark, Torald continued. He's planning to visit next month, along with his wife and children. They want to see for themselves how we've managed to create such loyalty among our people. Svala smiled, remembering her early fears about being accepted by Torald's family connections. Now, instead of being seen as an embarrassment or political liability, she was being regarded as an innovator whose ideas had practical value for other leaders. Will Gudrun be able to manage the additional guests? She asked. Gudrun can manage anything, Torald replied with amusement. Though I suspect she'll want to show off our new approaches to household organization. She's quite proud of the changes you've implemented. The relationship between Svala and the head housekeeper had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the hall's welfare. Gudrun had proven remarkably adaptable once she understood that Svala's innovations were intended to support, rather than replace, traditional management practices. Speaking of changes, Torald said, reaching into his belt pouch, I have something for you. He produced a small wooden box, similar to the one that had contained his mother's brooch, but clearly newer. When Svala opened it, she found a silver pendant in the shape of a loom, its threads represented by delicate strands of gold wire. I had it made by the silversmith in Westmark, he explained. The design is based on your large loom, the one where you created the silk for your wedding dress. Svala lifted the pendant carefully, admiring the craftsmanship that had captured not just the physical appearance of the loom, but something of its symbolic significance as well. It's beautiful, she said softly. But what's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to give my wife a gift? He asked. But there was something in his expression that suggested deeper meaning. Torald, she said, setting the pendant aside and turning to face him fully. What are you not telling me? He was quiet for a moment, studying her face, with the careful attention he brought to important decisions. I've been thinking about what the Alliance leaders asked us about heirs and bloodlines and the future of our holdings. Svala felt her chest tighten. They had not spoken directly about children since the crisis with the Alliance, though the subject hovered between them like an unfinished conversation. And, she asked quietly, and I've realized that we've already created something more lasting than biological inheritance, he said. We've built a community that will continue to thrive regardless of who leads it, because the bonds holding it together are based on choice and mutual benefit rather than mere tradition or fear. He reached for her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. But I've also realized that I would like very much to have children with you, not because political necessity requires it, but because I want to share with them the life we've created together. The confession took her breath away. Over the months of their marriage, she had come to care for him deeply, but she had never dared to hope that their relationship might evolve beyond mutual respect and practical cooperation into something that resembled the love she had once dreamed of. I want that too, she admitted, more than I thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the activity in the hall around them. Young Inga, the kitchen maid whose accident had led to Svala's first real confrontation with Gudrun, was now teaching newer servants the proper care of valuable dishes, not through fear and harsh words, but through patient demonstration and gentle correction. The approach reflected everything Svala had tried to accomplish in her management philosophy. Whatever happens, Torald said finally, whether we have children or not, we've proven that there are many ways to build a legacy. What we've created here will outlast us both. Svala nodded, understanding that he was speaking not just of the physical improvements to the hall or even the innovations in community organization, but of something more fundamental, a demonstration that people could choose to care for each other, that leadership could be based on service rather than dominance, that strength could be built through cooperation rather than conquest. As evening fell, and the hall, filled with the warm light of oil lamps and the comfortable sounds of people sharing the end of another day, Svala reflected on the journey that had brought her from the margins of village life to the center of a thriving community. The silver loom pendant caught the firelight, its golden threads gleaming like tiny promises of all the patterns yet to be woven, all the connections yet to be made, all the bonds yet to be chosen and strengthened through daily acts of care and commitment. She had learned to build something far stronger than anyone had expected from the materials she had been given. And, in doing so, she had discovered that the most powerful transformations often began with the simplest recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and that the greatest strength comes from weaving individual gifts into patterns larger and more beautiful than any single thread could create alone.